Hello, friends. As many of you are doubtless aware, there are a great many books that have been written on the last days of the Third Reich. A lot of books that have in fact focused on Hitler's last few days, his suicide in his own bunker, his marriage to Eva Braun, just a few hours before his death. And, of course, the battle over Berlin, and then the takeover of Berlin by the Soviets. And then many of you would perhaps have read about the liberation of the concentration camps and the end of the war. Now, the book that I'm going to talk about today, I'm grateful to one of my students for having drawn my attention to it some months ago, and when I dipped into the book, I found it so fascinating that I put aside everything else and went through the book. I haven't read every single page of it. I've read most of it, and this is the kind of book that you don't really have to read from the beginning to the very end, from the front cover to the back cover. It's a book that you can dip into, although I would suggest that one read at least chunks of it at every reading rather than just reading a few pages. Now, the book that I'm talking about is called Swan Song, 1945, a collective diary of the last days of the Third Reich. And this book is by Walter Kempowski, Kempowski, a German writer, apparently a major German writer. I must confess that I hadn't heard of him. And this book is part of a project called Ecolot, or Soundings, which is a 10-volume project in German. And what we have here is the English translation of what I think is the 10th volume, the last volume of this particular project. So what Kempowski seeks to do, the subtitle suggests, of course, exactly what I'm going to say, namely that it is a collective diary of the last days of the Third Reich. Collective meaning here that what he does is he takes the voices of literally hundreds of people. And these hundreds of people are not all in Germany. There were people living in America, people living in Poland, in Russia, in Czechoslovakia, and so on. And of course, England. And see how these people, some of whom are eminent writers and some of whom are people that you would have no reason to know about, because these are people from all walks of life, right? How they were digesting the news that was coming forth as the Nazi regime was crumbling. Right? So it's essentially a diary which really looks at 1 month and looks really at 4 days. And those 4 days are April 20th, 1945, which was Hitler's 56th birthday, April 25th, April 30th, the day that Adolf Hitler committed suicide, and then May 8th, 1945, VE Day, that is Victory Europe Day, the victory of the Allies over the Axis forces. Right? So these are the 4 days, and for each of these 4 days, the book is about 450 pages, so for each of these 4 days, he offers the testimony of several dozen, perhaps 100, perhaps 200, I didn't count, people, and looks at how they were reflecting on the events of that particular day and those times. And it's really quite an interesting read, precisely for this reason that usually, for example, if you, let's say you pick up William Shirer books, William Shirer, a famous American journalist, there's a small excerpt, perhaps half a page, and he wrote a huge book on the decline and fall of the Third Reich. William Shirer also wrote a beautiful memoir of Mahatma Gandhi, which I'm going to discuss at some point this year. This year meaning the new year. Right? So he's a major American journalist, and let's say that you read his account, but then you would be reading only one account. I mean, it's a 1,000-page book that he wrote. So what you have here is a benefit of Kempowski's having plowed through hundreds of different narratives to give you a sense of those momentous days and how they were being experienced and interpreted by people from all walks of life. So some of the people that he draws upon are people who's are really well known. So he draws upon the testimony of Margaret Bourke White, an American photographer for Life magazine, who, again, just like William Shirer, is also known for her work on India because she wrote a beautiful book on India. She happened to be in India in 1947 at the time of partition, and some of the last photographs of Gandhi are by Margaret Bourke White. There's also the testimony of course, Hitler, and some of Hitler's closest associates, and Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels, and the Reich governor Franz von Epp, Mussolini, the writers Thomas Mann, who happened to be living in Pacific Palisades, and there's a little segment there, a little excerpt from his correspondence or diary, where he says that he was actually having a haircut in Westwood. Westwood is where UCLA is, which is where I teach. So it was, a little charming, nostalgic, perhaps some people might say, to see that little excerpt there. But the writers from whose works we have small excerpts include not just Thomas Mann, but Edmund Wilson, Brecht, Elias Canetti, Arthur Miller, Arthur Doblin, and several others. There's also the artist Oskar Kokoschka. There's a political theorist, Richard Falk, and, of course, other political luminaries, such as Stalin, Dwight Eisenhower, and the diplomat George Kennan. But as I said, he draws upon Kempowski, the author, the compiler, also draws upon the writings of ordinary people, of journalists, of a radio operator working for the German army, of soldiers, of concentration camp survivors. And these are survivors from several different concentration camps, Theresienstadt, Dachau, Buchenwald, several others, soldiers, artists, prisoners of war, businessmen, housewives, doctors, clerics, and many others, right? So he's drawing upon all of their works. In some case, it might have simply been a letter. In some case, it might be some kind of recorded testimony available in an oral archive. In some cases, of course, and the majority of them, I would say, are excerpts drawn from published works. Right? Now, let me say a thing or two about Kempowski, and then give you some idea about the nature of this work, convey some of its flavor. And I want to reiterate that I think that this book is best read not in a single sitting over the course of an entire day or two, but rather it's a book that one can dip into over several days. Now, Kempowski, that is its author, at the age of 16, in February 1945, so just a few months before the end of the war, he was conscripted into Luftwaffe Youth Auxiliary Anti-Aircraft Unit, right? So Luftwaffe was the German Air Force. His father was a veteran of World War I and was killed in April 1945, just days before Hitler's birthday, and then subsequently the fall of Berlin and the fall of Nazi Germany. Now, Kempowski served in a Soviet and later in a East German prison. He spent about 8 years in all. And the question that really began to animate him, right? So recall what I mentioned, that this book is really the 10th book in what is a 10-volume project in German. As far as I'm aware, the other volumes have not been translated into English. And for all I know, this book may actually may not be simply the 10th volume, but might be, in fact, a compendium which draws upon the 10-volume project, taking excerpts from various volumes. But what is really important here is that what animated Kempowski was this fundamental question: what knowledge did ordinary Germans have about what was happening in the course of the war, and in particular what was happening in the concentration camps, right? And this is, of course, a question that has animated a great many scholars and historians. And he's also interested in the ordinary people's account of World War II. What did the war mean for them? What did it mean for people who, even in affluent countries, and Germany was certainly, relative to most other countries of the world, affluent, even though, of course, Germany, like much of the world, had gone through a Great Depression, and of course Germany had lost World War I and then had to pay reparations, and those were some of the circumstances which led to the rise of Hitler. But nevertheless, Germany was still an affluent country, and particularly by the 1930s, and it had to be in order to be able to develop an enormous military machine, right? So what did it mean for ordinary Germans themselves to live through the war, right? And one of the most touching segments here for excerpts in this book comes, for example, on, I made a note of some of the pages here. It comes, I think, somewhere around page 300 or thereabouts. I think I've lost track of what page it was. But this is an account where a German, not a German, and I think an English soldier talks about having entered Berlin and seeing Germans literally begging for food. This is perhaps something that I think he had not really quite expected, right? So Kempowski is someone who's interested in the ordinary person's experience. And of course, some of you might think to yourself, well, why does he include the testimony of writers, really eminent writers and artists, such as Thomas Mann, Oskar Kokoschka, the composer Victor Klemperer, and many others? And that's because he says that as he was collecting this testimony, reading hundreds of accounts, it occurred to him, and this is reflected in the later volumes, that he should not be confining himself only to the testimony of ordinary people. He modified his thinking and therefore introduced the voices of great artists, writers, philosophers, thinkers, but also the voices of some of the major political actors, such as Hitler, Churchill, Stalin, Himmler, Goebbels, Goering, and many others, right? So, as I've pointed out, he picks 4 days. And there are, of course, some things that one sees throughout. One sees, for example, that Hitler, to the very end, remained not simply unrepentant, right, but that he continued to berate, criticize, and malign Jews. He expended his venom on them, right? I mean, this is one of the most remarkable things. It's, I mean, it may not come as a surprise, but to see his own testament, his own writings, his own correspondence. So, for example, page 229, 30th April 1945, he's writing when he's in his bunker, 3 days before the outbreak of the German-Polish War, I proposed a solution to the German-Polish problem to the British ambassador in Berlin to keep it under international control, like the Saarland. That offer cannot simply be denied either. It was only rejected because the leading circles in English politics wanted war, partly because of the business to be had from it, and partly driven by propaganda organized by international Jewry. Right? And I want to return to this in just a moment, but on page 239, he says, "But I've also made it quite clear that if the nations of Europe are again to be regarded as mere shares to be bought and sold by these international conspirators in the world of money and finance, then there is one people that will be held responsible, that is a real culprit in this murderous struggle. Jewry, Jews. I also left no one in doubt that this time not only would millions of the children of Europe's Aryan people die of hunger, not only would millions of adult men suffer death, and hundreds of thousands of women and children be burned and bombed in the towns without the real criminal, albeit by more human means, having to atone for that guilt." So for him it was always clear that the real criminals were Jews. And this is a theme that persists. And again, one of the most interesting things is the extent to which many Germans really remained unrepentant. And I think it takes courage for a German writer like Kempowski to include excerpts from these ordinary Germans, and in some cases not so ordinary Germans, in his book, because what he's trying to suggest is that, well, we lost the war, but there are a great many Germans who still persisted in believing that Hitler's agenda was, in fact, the correct agenda. The agenda that would, if it had succeeded, led to the glory of the German people. Right? So, for example, on page 349, we have here on page 349 the testimony, the writing of a German by the name of Hans Friedrich Blunk, who lived from 1888 to 1961, and he says towards the end of this excerpt, this is a little over a page long, this excerpt, "In every nation we find examples of such criminal groups." Right? So here he's talking about the Gestapo, and right, and he says that there were some criminals in that group. Russians and English history are both full of them. But it is now the case that we have lost the war, that we have no opportunity to reply, and that the victor as witness has power on his side. So the victor has the power of witnessing, right? And in common layman language, the victor writes the narrative. And so therefore it's also going to be victor's justice. This is what this writer is suggesting. But of course there's something preposterous as well in what he says when he says that we had no opportunity to reply. Right? The captain claimed to know, so this is a reference to a captain, in the army, claimed to know about people who had been hung by their feet, who had been nearly suffocated in sewers. He's talking about the punishment meted out to Germans. All day I felt like vomiting over the defilement of the name of our nation. right? He says, the way in which the name of my nation, the name of Germany, my fatherland was being defiled, it was just nauseating to me. But there's no reflection here about how Germany just didn't defile other nations, how it, in fact, actually waged a relentless war, not just against Jews, but against the Roma, against the Slavic people, against Russians. A relentless war where the assumption was that these people, in fact, are all subhuman. There's no self-reflexivity at all. This is what is interesting. And if I may go back to that little excerpt from Hitler, with which I started on page 229, what is again interesting here is that there is, of course, a kernel of truth when he says that, look, I proposed a solution, a diplomatic solution, before the outbreak of the German-Polish War. That's not where the kernel of truth is, really, right? But where that kernel of truth is when he says that the leading circles in English politics wanted war. Now, I think that that is the case, that leading circles in many countries, the United States being a prime example of that, want war, because the machinery of war is productive in many ways for the elites. Nationalism is a way of rousing people up. It's a way, of course, of being able to stifle dissent. And, of course, war making is a massively lucrative business. It has been for decades, particularly with the advent of modern warfare. Right? The American elites have always known that, and the German elites and the English elites knew that as well. Right? But let's move away from Hitler. Let's look at some of the other excerpts that we have, because some of them really are very moving and give us quite a lot of insights into what was happening in the course of these 3 to 4 weeks and how people were receiving, as I said, the news of what was happening. Right? The pages around Hitler's suicide are very interesting, because really you get the gist of it in about 8 or 10 pages. The fact that Hitler, for example, had 2 revolvers with him, because when he was found dead, because he wanted to be sure that in the event that one revolver failed, that there would be a second revolver there. He certainly did not want to be captured alive. Right? And Eva Braun had taken cyanide tablets, and once she had taken those, then Hitler put the revolver to his head and shot himself. But we have here, his secretary, his assistant, all of these people's testimony, often just a paragraph or 2 long, is offered there, right? And we have accounts of people coming to see him at just hours before his death, people weeping, and we have this comic kind of situation where even as he is about to, shoot himself dead, that hours before that, days before that, medals for bravery are being conferred on young German boys and men, right? With pomp and ceremony. And they're being conferred because the protocols of the state have to be carried out. The whole charade that this is a military enterprise and it's going to go on until the very end according to the strict protocols of the day. All of this has to be kept up with, right? And in fact, Goebbels actually has a, Goebbels was, of course, the propaganda minister, and someone who remained devoted to Hitler to the very end, So, there's a little excerpt which describes a farewell party that he gives for the Hitler Youth. Right? Now, so all of this is part of the kind of discussion around Hitler's end. But then you also get to hear what some writers were thinking about, what went through their mind when they heard this news, whether they were based in Poland or England or Los Angeles or somewhere else. One of the things I should say at the outset is that all the testimony that it draws upon is drawn from Europe. These are all European sources. It would have been very interesting if we had included, let's say, what Jawaharlal Nehru, what Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, what Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, right? I'm just taking major figures, but it's very well the case, I'm sure, that there were some ordinary people, even in India, in China, in Africa, in Latin America, right, in Mexico, who were reading about what was happening. And some of them must have recorded their thoughts. And of course, we could say that, well, this would have been even a larger enterprise than it already was for him to have done it. But this is simply to say that some people might say, well, this seems like a kind of a Eurocentric enterprise. I don't think that would be the right word at all to describe a work of this kind, but it does really offer European perspectives, not global perspectives, on what was happening in the last, as I said, few weeks of Nazi Germany. What are some of the more interesting kind of excerpts that we have? So on page 48, there is a page 48, there is a British sergeant by the name of Norman Kirby, who was serving in northwest Germany, right? And he says, during our investigation of the fire and its unlikely threat to the main body of the camp, so he's one of the people who's liberating a concentration camp, we again encountered the all too frequent problem of German deserters and would-be prisoners of war. Instead of going quietly home, as so many has it been ordered to do by hard-pressed frontline units, they persisted in giving themselves up. Could this have been inspired by the thought of Allied rations and the associated lightening of a burden on their starving families? Right? I think that this is very interesting. I just have to interrupt for a second because there's an unwanted light here, which I'm going to just take care of right away. All right, and back we go. Yeah, so suggesting that conditions in Germany were so bad that many of the Germans didn't mind being taken prisoners of war, because the likelihood is that they would have gotten better food. And that if they had gone back to their families, the families were starving and there would have been a burden on them, right? To us who had to cope with these increasing numbers in addition to our official duties, it began to seem as though barbed wire had a strange attraction for German soldiers. Disoriented by their unaccustomed freedom from military discipline and the loss of the feeling of security which years of barrack servitude and camp life had given them. I think this is a fascinating insight and something that I don't think one would have encountered, let's say, in an ordinary narrative history. And similarly, at the other end of it, one of the things that I found most interesting was a description where he suggests, the author suggests through the excerpt, that the concentration camp, that when the concentration camps were liberated, that, and this is something I have not heard of before, that in some concentration camps, the prisoners were asked to bear with the conditions that they had been living under for another 7 to 10 days, so that their, quote, lifestyle as prisoners in these camps could be accurately captured. Right? Let me give the quotation. This is page 270. This is the testimony of Johann Steinbock, a pastor who had been confined to the Dachau concentration camp. Dachau is in Munich. The misery of her homelessness wasn't lifted straight away. This is after the liberation. It was explained that we were going to be taken to the barracks of the SS camp, but they first had to be cleaned and furnished. The Americans kept wanting to photograph and film the wretchedness of the camp, and more visits and commissions came to be shown the original state of the camp. So we have to stay living a gypsy lifestyle together for a while. Immediate release from the camp to home isn't yet possible. I mean, this is really quite astonishing. I mean, who would have thought? You would have thought that people who had been, incarcerated in these camps have been victimized simply because they happen to be either Jewish or political prisoners or communists or Roma. And millions of them had paid with their lives already. To think that these people were then told, many of whom were no more than a skeleton when they were rescued, just a heap of bones, literally, right? To imagine that they were then told that, well, just continue with this for a few more days because we need to film the original condition of the camp for documentary purposes. I mean, it's really astonishing, mind-boggling, to use a colloquialism, right? So I think that what this book is really, does is it conveys the testimony of so many of these people in quite really extraordinary ways. I think that in concluding, because I could really offer accounts, I made copious notes in reading this book, that what I'd like to do is, in closing, is just give 2 or 3 more examples of some of the kinds of things that one encounters in reading this book. So here we have, I think, what is one of the most interesting of all the excerpts in this long book, and this is from Fernand Picard, Picard. He was an engineer. He was living in Paris. And he is talking about, so this is an entry from May 8th line, so this is Victory Europe Day, VE Day. This is when Germany had now signed the terms of surrender, and the war was officially over, right? And he says that people came out in Paris, right? And there were some celebrations. Of course, in London, people went wild. There, it's no question that the celebration was a full-fledged celebration. But he says that in Paris, it was a different kind of sensibility that one encountered. And so therefore I quote, "And yet in the expressions of that mass celebration, which he says he encountered, and I quote, "I didn't find the enthusiasm of 11 November 1918 or 14 July 1919. Right? The end of the war and the Treaty of Versailles. I remember that kind of intoxication that gripped the people of Paris during those days. They burst open the gates to the Invalides and took possession of the looted cannon to pull them through the capital. The events of those last 20 years, the broken promises, the disappointed hopes, have stripped the French of their proverbial lightness. All of those who came down from the suburbs today to celebrate the victory of the Allied armies and the end of the barbarian rule held within their joy the memory of all the disappointments of the past and the fear of the difficulties of the future. In 1918, the Parisians were celebrating not only the end of the war, but also of what they saw as the war to end all wars. Many of the viewers here, I'm sure, are aware of the fact that World War I is referred to as the Great War. It was the war to end all wars. And then, of course, there was World War II. Right? So when World War I ended, it was really not just the end of the war, but the war to end all wars. Today, no one yields to that illusion. This is Picard. They are all clear that the times ahead will be hard and full of threats, that we will have to fight to preserve not only peace, but also our place among the great nations. End quote. And similarly, we have another person, Claude Simon, born in 1913, who was writing in Paris. He was in Paris at that time. And he says, while the liberation of Paris in August 1944 was a cause for effervescent and sometimes brazen expressions of joy, 8th May 1945 was, strangely, almost a day like any other. The streets of Paris were quiet and deserted. I went back towards the center, thinking that something more or less spectacular might be happening there. And then he says, a couple of streets were full of people walking at random through the darkness like myself, in a kind of confusion, in silence, with no shouting or singing, as if the end of this terrible war in which the French, as they were entirely aware, had received such a small, poor share, had left them disoriented, uncertain, and baffled by the problems before them. Right? So, I think that this gives us some cause to reflect on what the end of the war meant. And it's very clear from the excerpts in this book, and of course from some other literature as well, that the end of World War II did not mean at all what the end of World War I meant. And this is, of course, also not even taking into account the fact that months later there would be the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Right? And that, I think, would have made these authors feel even more gloomy about characterizing the end of World War II as some kind of victory. And on this note, I want to end on this particular question, because one of the sources that he uses, one of the persons whose testimony Kempowski alerts us to, I was not familiar with this, is the testimony of Albert Schweitzer, right? A philosopher, one of the great ethical thinkers, lived from 1875 to 1965. And he talks about how he received the news of the end of the war on Monday, May 7th, at around midday. Right? Here's a little description of that. But I move to the end of his of that excerpt, because he says, "It's only in the evening that I came to my senses and am able to try to imagine what the end of hostilities in Europe means, and what the many people must be feeling who are able to experience a first night in years without fear of threatened bombing. While outside in the dark the palms rustle quietly, I take the little book of the sayings of Lao Tse, the great Chinese thinker of the 6th century BC, off the shelf and read his gripping words on war and victory." And then Schweitzer quotes Lao Tse. And this is typically, of course, how we often read books and how we encounter ideas. So this is Kempowski quoting Schweitzer, who in turn is quoting Lao Tse. Quote, "Weapons are tools of evil, not tools for the noble man. He uses them only in dire necessity. Calm and peace are the highest qualities for him. He is victorious but takes no pleasure in it. Anyone who delighted in it would be delighting in the murder of human beings. At the victory celebration, the leader should take his place after the custom of the funeral service. The killing of people in large numbers should be mourned with tears of compassion." I think that is what Ashoka realized about 300 BCE, roughly, when the mass killing by his army of the people of Orisha, Kalinga, took place. And that, as we know, that is when Ashoka had something like an epiphany. And he converted to Buddhism then. But let me go back to Lao Tse. The killing of people in large numbers should be mourned with tears of compassion. Therefore, he who wins in battle should weep as if at a funeral. End quote. Why is it, I think to myself, that so many of the loftiest thoughts all seem to come really from writers who wrote 2,500 years ago? Sometimes it seems that way, certainly, right? As though whatever had to be thought, that is, the gist of things, the ethical gist of things had been thought then. It sometimes seems that way. I end on that note. Thank you.